Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that helps you discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. I'm your host, Artem, and today's guest is a philosopher, writer, researcher, scientist, and craftsman. His work spans many fields, including social architecture, sensemaking, ethics and governance, and existential risk. His experience as a master woodworker led him to create the Magic Flight Launchbox, a beautifully crafted wooden portable vaporizer that many cannabis enthusiasts may be familiar with. He is also the author of several profound philosophical works, including An Immanent Metaphysics, Effective Choice, The Tiny Book of Essential Wisdom, and most recently, Western Core Tantra. Forrest Landry, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So I just like to set a little bit of context before we dive in. So I've come across your work several years ago and was really intrigued by it. All of your work feels very thought out and meticulous, like you've been sitting and meditating on it for years. And a lot of it I can't quite understand, but there is a sense like there is something very important within it that needs to be understood. And I think it's no coincidence that I've been seeing your name and face popping all over what people may call the liminal web. And there's like a growing hunger for the wisdom you provide and the way that you think about the world. Recently, I read your work, Western Core Tantra, and found it to be more accessible. And I believe that was part of your attention in creating it. And this resparked my interest and got me rereading your previous works. So I'd like to start by asking, how do your works, An Immanent Metaphysics, Effective Choice, The Tiny Book of Essential Wisdom, and Western Core Tantra, how do they contrast with one another? And also, what is like the central guiding principle or purpose behind your writing? What are you trying to convey? What are the big questions that you're addressing with your work?
So the way the books are organized, roughly speaking, is the Immanent Metaphysics is sort of the core work. So it provides the abstract theory upon which all the other works essentially rest. Being that it's abstract and maybe somewhat more oriented towards more academic or more, philosophy for philosophers sort of perspective, metaphysics for metaphysicians, perhaps. I didn't expect that it would be of general interest to very many people, although I'm sure that for some people it's of great interest. The Effective Choice was a book that it used to be part of the Immanent Metaphysics, and at one point I separated the two so that people who were interested in what parts of this philosophy could be maybe applied at an individual level to increase effectiveness in terms of their own life path or how they were making choices or navigating relationships. So in that sense, the Effective Choice is kind of the next book after the Immanent Metaphysics. And there is a book that connects the two together that shows the connections between the underlying theory and the kind of ideas that are in the Effective Choice. But the Effective Choice was written more for a general audience to be able to appreciate that content without necessarily needing to understand all the underlying theories. So obviously those references aren't part of the Effective Choice book anymore. But the Tiny Book was effectively a kind of an extract of some of the most compact and maybe useful aspects of the Effective Choice, and was really meant to be something that a person could carry with them. So a very small package, something that could be interacted with in a kind of ad hoc way. So I suggest, sort of bibliomancy, like hold some thought in mind, open to any page and see how those two things, what you were holding and what was printed there, interact. And that has been actually quite productive for a lot of people because it doesn't require them to read a bunch of text in advance. They can just start with what's on the page. So the Tiny Book has a lot less context in terms of the individual statements. The Western Core Tantra is similarly, it's an extract from the Effective Choice, but one with an emphasis on the parts of the practice and the principles that can kind of connect at a more spiritual level. So in this sense, I'm sort of considering it as a kind of view of an ancient tradition from the lens of the metaphysics and the ways in which those principles and practices can be brought to clarity. So that was one major intention behind that, because there's a lot about that body of philosophy that is, I think, still very, very relevant, particularly these days. As rule systems become increasingly, as the world changes and the rule systems stay the same, of course, then they eventually become increasingly maladaptive to the circumstances. And so while rules are very helpful as a heuristic for navigating situations, if you know kind of a way to sort of think about something quickly, then it can be quite easily, something that just is simpler for a variety of people. But once we kind of get to a place where, well, these rules don't work anymore, then we need to go back to the principles, encounter them in a sort of sense of nakedness and a sense of humility, and to really embody those principles in new practices that are appropriate for circumstance. So in that sense, Tantra has been viewed as a somewhat transgressive art, but part of the reason for the transgression is because it's not following the rules anymore. It's going back to principles. And so in this sense, to be willing to have a direct encounter with principles and to use those as a guide for creating new practices, I think is one of the central tenets of that philosophy. So in that sense, there was an intent to clarify some of the principles of daily practice. And there's also a kind of restructuring. So if you look at the way the language is laid out, I've come to notice over the years that people, once they have heard me speak, they kind of understand the phrasing structure that I'm using, and that it becomes a lot easier to read the text because they kind of know where I put the pauses and where the sentence breaks are. And so in that sense, I've adopted a style of writing, which effectively, although it's still prose, it's still an aphorism form. I'm putting explicit line breaks where I tend to put pauses. And so in that sense, it becomes easier to read for someone who hasn't already encountered me in some direct sense. It's a little bit of an experiment in that sense. My personal opinion is that it looks a lot easier. It's a lot easier for me to read. And so I'm hoping that it's easier for other people to really take in, like, what is the essence of what I'm getting at and why this particular interpretation might be more useful. In terms of what's overall motivating a lot of this work, one way to sort of describe kind of the orientation is that I'm very much in service to nature. I'm in service to the wild. I'm in service to the beauty of life. And I see that in order to really fulfill on that, I need to have a deep understanding of technology, and I need to have a deep understanding of humanity, because those are both very strong forces currently in interaction with life in a broad sense, the ecology or the ecosystem. And so if I'm wanting to provide or promote well-being of what I would consider to be the sacred, i.e. life itself, the value of this planet as a totality in the context of the larger universe, then I'm wanting to help people to see and to hold the balance of the relationship between humanity, machinery, and nature, fundamentally. Technology as machinery, humanity, man and woman, and just the whole sphere of culture and how we hold idea and idealization and things like that. And then finally, nature being all the trees and the animals and essentially the rest of what we consider the biosphere. So in that sense, although I am writing primarily to human beings, and a lot of times I'm writing about technology, in the larger sense, the motivation is to really provide the tools and the architecture by which large communities can make much better choices in the space of things like existential risk and civilization design. And what would be the ways in which we would motivate those choices? Like, what would be the kind of things that would be principles upon which those choices could be made, most broadly speaking. So in a sense, if we are looking at sort of the long epoch of human history, or just life history on this planet, the first, say 100,000 years to roughly 500 years ago, the philosophy and religion and the cultural dynamics would be largely oriented around navigating change. The world changes. There's a sense of flow in nature, and that in the connectedness with that flow, that we are going to be, skillful and dance and be in like surfing, in a sense. It's like a balancing, and it's a skillful dance to be in the flow and to move with flow. And this, of course, is on a lot of levels, on a biological level, particularly a very satisfying way to live. And then, roughly 500 years ago, but of course, going back to agriculture and things like that, that there was this sort of knowledge that we could begin to start to think about the world in terms of causation. We could begin to understand, well, this happens, and then this happens, and then this other thing happens. And these recurrences can be counted on and can be relied on as a guide for the actions that we might take. And instead of consulting with a priest who is trying to mediate an awareness of larger forces, in this case, whether they be divinity or natural forces, that we could just directly firsthand ask nature and come to know what would necessarily be causal relationships, antecedent to consequence and things like that. And so when you look at Descartes, and there's a sort of separation between man and nature, or male and female, or mind and body, or the ways in which families were divided, divide and conquer, of course, has made great sense from an economic perspective, but in the sense of creating community and relationship to life and sort of balance of flow, that being in right relationship with change. That in this sense, we've come to a place where being out of connection, even though we've mastered technology, we've learned from science. Science is a study of causation. Basically, it's about causation, and then applied causation, which would be technology. And of course, we have this entire world that we live in has largely, from the rooms. Both of us are sitting in environments that actually there's not a single non-artificial element in either of the visuals that we are presenting to each other, aside from our own faces, actually. And so in that sense, there's a notion here that we are needing to be much more skillful in the space of choice, right? That there's a sense in which that which is real. So one of the things that comes out of the metaphysics, it's a very, very deep idea, is that that which is real partakes at once of choice, change, and causation. If any one of those ingredients or any one of those aspects is null, then the notion of real is not. And so in this sense, we have now a sense of real as being at once choice, change, and causation as a kind of fundament, and anything that isn't partaking of that is illusion. That in the sense we've developed skillfulness as a species, as a total humanity. We've learned, have at least at one point had a certain mastery of navigating change. And more recently, we've come into a kind of mastery of causation, but now we need to come into skillfulness in the space of choosing well and wisely, choosing in a way that would enable responses to the world that is still changing, and accounting for the causation of nature, accounting for the causation of the natural world in a way that is actually inclusive, is actually holistic, is actually an appropriate response. So when we're looking at things like existential risk, it's largely the result of unconscious choice forces, or marketplace forces, for example, or governance dynamics that just aren't well adapted to making the kind of changes that are needed in this space. When the complexity goes beyond a certain point, and you don't have sound bites or easy ways of making it simple enough for most people to relate to, or constructing a singular vote out of it, this option or that option or whatever. When the situation requires long-term planning, multi-generational responses, rather than something that can be done in a single quarter, it's not going to be possible within election cycles or governance cycles, or even the lifetime as a single individual, to have the wisdom necessary to really genuinely respond to these sorts of circumstances. So in a sense of responding to Fermi paradox sort of issues, is it possible for a technological civilization to endure? Then the level of skillfulness that's needed in the space of choice is going to be vastly greater than that which is currently available or currently practiced in any governance architecture anywhere in the world, or any market process currently in the world. In other words, at this particular point, when I'm looking at what are the architectures of the fields of capability that are needed to address civilization collapse issues or existential risk issues, the absolute threshold of skillfulness in that is actually substantially greater than those results which are produced by the civilizational techniques that have been available to us so far. So broadly speaking, this is an answer to your question of what's motivating me to do this. Well, partly it is recognizing that need. I am developing the kinds of articulations of the fundamental nature of choice itself, so that the dynamics of how we translate those principles into practices are clear. Like knowing what are the principles of effective choice, knowing what are the statements of the non-relativistic ethics, and how does that emerge from a deeper set of truths about the nature of consciousness, truths that are inherent in the nature of being itself, translate into practices that would be genuinely a response in a holistic way to things like ecological destruction, or things like genocide or existential risk. What are the ways in which we can hold these very challenging questions, and to be able to move with that skillfully enough that we actually move into a place of health and vitality as a world, as a sphere of life floating in space. And so in this sense, my work is very much motivated to provide the resources and tools in the sense of the conceptual infrastructure necessary to be able to navigate these kinds of issues. And so in one sense, it has this tremendous level of abstraction, and it has a projection that is essentially accessible for practice at an individual level. But largely my work over the last few years specifically, but certainly going all the way back to the beginning, is about how these concepts can essentially enable the well-being of humanity for the maybe trillions of people that would come after if we somehow manage to survive all of this. So in this sense, it's like I'm working to build the capability within communities to have the capability to, in themselves to develop the kinds of solutions necessary in many critical risk areas. So that's broadly, a summary of what I'm doing and how it's held and the ways in which this comes together.
Yeah, it's very inspirational and wide-ranging, and bridging the gap between nature, humanity, and technology. It's like a triple, and the triple pops up a lot in your work. I'm curious, how do you understand and think about truth? There's something that you write that kind of stands out, and I've seen this a couple of times. I think you've written it in a couple of your works, and that's the process of learning and finding truth is more effective when one searches for what is true rather than for that which is false. So maybe you could kind of expand on how you orient to truth, how you look for truth, how you understand truth.
There's a lot of aspects to a question like that. So
yeah.
So one of them is kind of the perspective of the metaphysics on truth. There's also, things like the distinction between lowercase and capital T truth, which is also of considerable interest to.
I was curious about that too. Actually, that was one of my questions. The doctrine of two truths, ultimate truth, and I was curious on your take on that as well.
Yeah, there's an essay on that specifically. In fact, I did write about this on the mflb.com website. So I don't remember what section it's in, but somewhere in the philosophy or the metaphysics, there's this thing about capital T truth. And the basic summary, first of all, just to kind of put it into language rather than just saying, hey, go read the essay, was more along the lines of the relationship between truth and falsity. So you have things that are true and things that are false, right? I mean, they can be statements, right? Usually when we're thinking about truth and falsity, most of the time, it's like in a mathematical community, it's going to be held in terms of, can I derive this statement from these premises using these tools, right? Whatever the inference rules are. And in that fairly limited context, we would see, well, there's things that I can't derive, so I call those false statements, and things that I can derive, and I call those true statements. But the relationship between truth and falsity is not itself an element of the truth or an element of the falsity. Right? It's its own category. So the metaphysics would basically say, well, given that the relationship between truth and falsity is a deeper concept than either the concept of truth or falsity, then to some extent, we have to have this meta notion of truth if we're going to do that. So in one way, we can consider that the difference between, say, lowercase t truth and uppercase t truth. The uppercase would be the sort of meta version. But the notion of truth and falsity, as I've mentioned already, is something that's applied within this sort of omniscient frame, or what I would consider to be, kind of enclosing context, i.e. the truth relative to these circumstances, or relative to these axioms and in this constellation of tools that we can use rules of inference. So in other words, it makes sense to think about truth from a mathematical perspective. But in the larger field of life, in first-person interaction, for example, or in narrative storytelling, for example, the notion of truth isn't held the same way. In the first-person perspective, in the here and now of relationship, the notion of truth is non-contingent. It's not specific about the environment. There is just the first-person fact of I'm here now, right? This is what happened rather than this is what could have happened. There's a difference between things that are near and things that are far away. And there's a difference between this moment and those moments that have been and those moments that could yet be. So in this sense, the notion of truth is held as a non-contingent of a position in time, a position in space, and a position in possibility, as being like the ordinating basis from which those notions of position can even be held. So that non-contingency of the now is, and no qualifier is kind of a specific notion of truth, and that has a more capital T flavor than a lowercase t flavor, and that's again affirmed by this axiom of relationship is more fundamental than identity, or that the betweenness is more basic aspect of beingness than even the things related, which goes back to the sort of way it was held in the mathematics sense. But then there is this sort of transcendent notion of truth, which is neither of these two things that I've just referred to, which is there's as a fan of Star Trek, for example, or just science fiction in general, there was this one episode where the character Worf is telling this sort of mythology, and then one of the people in his audience basically says, "Well, is that story true?" And his response was, "I continue to find new truths every time I tell it." And so, in this sense, the notion of truth as a sort of discovery, as a sort of I'm looking to see ways in which the patterns of this narrative create insight into my life and into circumstances and the things that are meaningful in the sense of connection, in the first person relationship, not just in the sense of theory, but in the sense of a deep sort of affirming and attunement to life itself, to the way in which we hold connectedness, relationally, both with oneself deeply and profoundly, in the sense of relationship between self and spirit, or between self and world, in the sense of connection to ecology, and obviously between one another, connection to other, in the sense of human personal relationships. And so, in this sense, to have insight about those things and the immediacy of the experience of those, and to have a sort of overarching wisdom as to how to make better choices in those spaces, because our perceptions have become more attuned to what is. That, in this sense, our practice of consciousness, if we're going to the process of being conscious, becomes increased. And this, of course, is in many ways a good thing. So in this specific sense, the notion of truth is something that one reaches for, reaches out to, or in a sense encounters in a sense of discovery that we don't. This is also, by the way, a profound question of metaphysics. Is the truth discovered or is it created? In mathematics, it's largely a created thing, but in the sense of the transcendent, it's largely a discovered thing. In the sense of science, we learn the truth of causality, we learn natural laws. Whereas in metaphysics, because there is this sense of both finding in the sense of discovering something and also creating in the sense of we make choices, and there's an element of truth in the choosing. Like if we have, through the exercise of insight from the transcendent notion of truth, come to have profound connection, have a sense of deep presence, that in that sense the choices that we make can be reflective of a deeper reality of what is present in that moment and what is wanting to be responded to. And so in this sense there's a feeling of truthfulness that is coming through one's actions, one's quality of being. And this is something that is genuinely a desirable characteristic. It's something we would search for and strive for. And in that sense, the boundary between discovering truth and creating truth is erased. And in the choices that I'm making, to the degree that they're infusing these deep elemental sort of realities, biological realities, or deep spiritual realities, the sense of the sacred is infused in the moment of the speaking. That there is a sense in which we can see that discovery and creation are the same. And this is now flipping beyond just the immanent, the omniscient, the transcendent. This is now looking at the notion of truth in a much broader way. It's looking at goodness and beauty and holding those in a combined way, right? There's a sense here in which we are discovering the beauty of life and creating it, and that our choices become good choices in the sense that they have health and vitality and affirmation, and that they are holistic and responsive to more of the totality of what is. And so in this sense, truth becomes essentially held at a level of principle that transcends specific circumstances, becomes non-contingent in yet another way. It becomes, not just a principle that's applicable in this particular world or in this particular context, but one that's generally applicable in every world and in every context. And when we get to being able to articulate truths in that particular sense, the notion of, cannot not be the case. There's a sense here in which we're folding over the field of potentiality, and that's a very specific technical language. I tend to get a little upset when people use it, because the notion of to know something so well that you can be sure that it is always the case cannot not be the case. There's a level of precision and rigor and discipline that is required to hold that well. And so in that specific sense, the notion of truth expressed in that profound way is something which we could regard as a kind of capital T truth as well. But this referring back to your sense of thoughtfulness and clear meditation and knowing how to feel through the assumptions and to even notice them as assumptions, and therefore as things that could be explored and questioned and recontextualized as maybe ways of discovering other truths. So to search for truth is to find it. To not search for the truth is to be without it, basically. And that's the aphorism that is a reflection of this whole line of thinking.
It's profound. So much there. So much to chew on and to decipher. I'm interested if you can explain how you understand what is ethics and how it relates to morality. I find that really interesting.
Great. So the thing about this is actually a great context, because the notion of morality, the way I hold it, is essentially a set of rules or heuristics that would work well in a particular field of context, in a particular domain. So, for instance, on internet email lists, for example, it's generally discouraged for someone to write a post in all uppercase letters. These days, this isn't so much of an issue, but back in the early days of the internet, there would be occasionally people as if they had the caps lock key stuck on, but it was mostly because of the equipment that they were using. They could only post in uppercase letters. And some people just got into the habit of that. And of course, it leads to all sorts of ambiguities. Like, for instance, can you tell the difference between Polish and polish if you don't know what the capitalization of the letter is? And so one refers to a country and the other refers to something you wipe your shoe with. So in this sense, to also have all uppercase letters is to seem as if you don't have any subtlety about something. You're broadcasting a message with maximal emotional emphasis. And so, obviously that might not always be the case, but you can't tell because it's in all uppercase letters. So in this sense, there's this heuristic, a rule: don't post all uppercase letters. And that could be regarded as the morality of that domain, i.e., what are the social codes that help us to integrate together as a group? Right. So in the sense of religion or community, in the sense of being about a kind of inclusiveness, and you can characterize the effectiveness of a religion or a community in the sense of, what kinds of things can they accept and process and still have a kind of inclusiveness around. There's a great movie called Shaka Wat, which has this as a theme. It's actually quite beautiful. So in a sense, there's a notion here that if we are going to really be clear about what are the rules that are the best rules possible to create social cohesion, to create a sense of flow or community, or to hold people in the right sort of relationships and have some balance around that, then what are the principles that would be used to even know what those things are? Like, how would we assess something like that? And so in that sense, this is now the basis by which we can consider the notion of ethics. Ethics is the principles of effective choice. And it's called non-relative because it's not specific to a domain. It's not specific to a particular person. The principles are specific to the notion of choice itself. So in a sense, when we're saying, what is a good choice, somewhere along the way, we have to ground the notion of choice. We have to understand the reality of choice. And as I mentioned earlier, choice, notion of real is that which is at once choice, change, and causation. There's ways to show that this is consistent with physics and it's consistent with many other fields of modern philosophy. I know that there's obviously a lot of areas of physics that would say that time and choice and consciousness just don't exist. And technically that's correct. But that's because they're using the word exist. There's a difference between to say something exists, to say something is real, and to say something is objective. And of course, science is really good at thinking about existence if it's using mathematics, and objectivity if it's using the scientific method. But talking about being, talking about real, is yet another category. So we can think about to be or to be real in one category as essentially asserting something very different than to say that something's objective or to say something exists. So in that sense, free will does not exist. In fact, thinking about it as being free is again, it's a sort of way of thinking about it in terms of constraint. It's an omniscient view, and the notion of will as a kind of dominance or force over or some sort of compulsion, from the subjective to the objective. Well, that doesn't really work either. So in that sense, I'm in complete concurrence that free will doesn't exist, and that the notion itself is inconsistent, it's incoherent. But to talk about choice is to talk about something else, and choice is real. There's a notion in which there can be things that are real that don't exist. So time is real, it doesn't exist. Creation is real, it doesn't exist. So in that sense, as you get more disciplined in thinking about these categories and how they're held and what are the relationships between them, such like that, it becomes possible to, through a series of conceptual transformations, to essentially arrive at principles of effective choice, having grounded the notion of choice itself and the notion of goodness itself, because you need a notion of what is meant by the notion of choice and what is meant by the notion of goodness to have principles about goodness, right? Choices as being wise or appropriate or well balanced. So the theory of and the study of ethics is essentially an inquiry into the nature of good choice. And therefore, the metaphysics provides a sense as to how to hold that and why that particular grounding is necessary. Specifically because, in the sense that ethics is an inquiry into the nature of good choice, that it wants to be applied to some pretty difficult choices, spaces that would be again quite challenging for communities to deal with. Things like existential risk are not trivial. We really need to know that we're making a choice that is going to be a good choice, won't have unintended consequences, won't trigger other categories of existential risk or some sort of chain of interactions. So in many cases, it's not just that we are wanting to uphold the thing of precautionary principle in general, but just that we have a deep sense as to the value structure and the meaning structure and purposes that connect all those things together. The meanings that connect the purposes to the values and why we would want to hold value a certain way and so on. That these understandings are all part of what we would think of as ethics. And so in that sense, we want the ethics to be quite coherent, quite structured, quite powerful in the sense of providing clarity about things that clarity is really, really needed, where we only have one choice, one time, and we got to get it right on the first shot. So in that sense, the metaphysics wants to be disciplined, it wants to be thoughtful, and the statement of ethics wants to be equally clear as a set of tools from which we can create, answers to the most difficult questions, but also as a guide for the sort of principles turned into ethics. Ethics basically turned into morality as we go from the general sense of choice in specific domains to the specific sense of individuals in particular domains. So in that sense, you could think of the relationship between like mathematics and physics is a little bit like the relationship between metaphysics and more ethics and morality. If that helps.
Yeah, one thing that you said that stood out was that free will and choice are different. So can you expand a little bit on that? Because I think like a lot of people get stuck, like I'm a little stuck there in understanding that.
Well, part of it is first of all to notice that, it's just a general thing in Western cultures in particular to hold the notion of free will, choice, and decision as if they're the same thing. And they're not the same thing. They actually represent three different things. For example, I hear people use the word decision and use the word choice as if they were interchangeable. And the way in which you might characterize the difference between, say, decision and choice is that a decision is to cut away, decide, right? Side is like the same root as suicide or genocide or something, right? So to cut away, to essentially cease those as options. Whereas choice doesn't necessarily need you to treat it as a cutting away. It could also be treated as essentially creating of a new response. Like if I was, presented with 3 options and said, which one of these do you do? Well, I get to make the move of, well, those 3 options aren't what I want. I want this option, and this is what option 4 looks like. Tristan Harris talks about it as things not on the menu, right? So to be able to have an imagination that is inclusive enough to really think about a broader set of options than that which was presented, things which could genuinely be win-win choices or win-win-win-win on and on, right? That to think about choice from the flexibility of one's imagination and to develop capacities to broaden the scope of one's capacity to imagine or to have intelligence and apply that imagination is much more the domain in which choice would be held, rather than to cut away options, to as often create new options and then to select those. But the notion of free will as a thing is actually sort of a conflation of as I said, 2 words. The notion of freedom, as if it was essentially an absence of constraints, is largely a reference to the notion of determinism. So, in other words, to say not determined, right? To say something is free is to say that it's not determined by prior circumstances, but this is largely a result of the conflation between science and mathematics. So mathematics may be a great language with which to represent scientific concepts, but the scientific concepts are causal concepts, whereas mathematical concepts are logical ones. And logic has a sense of defined all the way down to the scale of essentially nothing, of 0. And so in effect, they're perfectly specified. But causation is not perfectly specified. In other words, you can say, well, this antecedent, broadly speaking, leads to this consequent, broadly speaking. But I don't necessarily need to know the details of every little thing about the antecedent or the consequent to know that relationship exists. Whereas to say that something is deterministic is to say that actually there's no possibility that you do know the details all the way down to the infinitely small, and that there's essentially a direct relationship in the sense of logic of this entails that. So to speak of freedom in this sense is essentially to have first of all, the idea that life and reality is deterministic, and that somehow or another I'm going to be outside of this determinism. Of course, most philosophers would reject that flat out because they've already assumed that reality is deterministic. But if I actually look at what's been discovered in things like I hesitate to mention this because it's become such a trope, but the idea that objective potentiality exists, or the notion of potentiality as being objective. And again, you notice that this language, I'm quoting other articles when I say objective potentiality, or the notion that objective potentiality exists is coming out of the literature of quantum mechanics, which is unfortunately probably some of the most confused philosophical literature ever written. There's so much stuff that people hinge their philosophy on top of that, and it's unfortunate because there is some deep things that are being observed there, which is the idea that objective randomness, or that there's a notion of hard randomness, that there are things that are real but are inherently unpredictable, and that in this sense of being unpredictable, they're unconditioned. They are, in a sense of not being determined, they are free, right? But it's not the kind of freedom that one person would regard as meaningful, because if I look at randomness in the universe, it's assumed that the notion of randomness is therefore meaningless. When we think about choice, and the first person sense of having made a choice, because you can't think about choice in the third person or the second person sense, really. I mean, you experience choice in the first person. And so, and again, the notion of choice as being real is attached to the first person relationship. It's not something I can't make choices yesterday or tomorrow. I can only make choices now. And so in this sense, when tomorrow is today, then I can make choices in that context. But the nowness is always the now. And so in this sense, there's a sort of recognition that we can't hold the notion of choice or the notion of freedom as being connected to this sort of overarching model. It's really connected to the immediacy. And this, of course, is observed when we think about freedom and limitation. the metaphysics, for example, as I write it, would say something along the lines of, well, for every limitation, there's two kinds of freedom. And for every freedom, there's two kinds of limitation. I say kinds because they're distinct. There's a true multiplicity in both directions. But that kind of freedom doesn't necessarily imply the same kind of meaningfulness that one feels inside when one's making a choice, like one's coordinating their actions with respect to their deep subjective intentions, all of which are unobservable. So there's a kind of meaningfulness that is known and felt and experienced in a subjective firsthand sense that is not experienced in looking at things that are random and coming from the outside as perceived. So in this particular sense, in the sense that science would only be able to describe things that are both observable and repeatable, i.e., if it's not repeatable, like the kind of random sort of thing, then the notion of randomness is already outside of the field of science. And the notion of meaningfulness, in the sense that it's a subjective quality, which is not to say that it isn't real, it's just that it's already itself not observable. So therefore, the notion of freedom, in the sense of free will, is outside of the scope of science fundamentally, and therefore also out of the scope of mathematics. And so in that sense, this is just all the things that are happening before we even get to the notion of thinking about will. Right? Will would basically hold that the subjective was somehow more primary than the objective, or the relationship between self and objective. And so in that sense, there's a sort of reality here of the relationship between self and reality is more basic than both self and reality. So how is it that you're going to have self as a kind of conditionalization or control over reality, or even over the relationship between self and reality, when the relationship is more primary? So the notion of will as a kind of dominance is itself a reflection of a sort of a cultural paradigm. It's very much a Western thing, Descartes, etc., talking about separation, first of all, and then in the sense that the master is, in a sense, going to dominate the slave, or it's going to dominate the situation, that we can actually have control in the universe. There's no such thing as control. Control is an illusion. It's like, you remember I referring earlier to that which is real contains choice, change, and causation together. But if I try to talk about control, I've already removed the element of choice. And so in that sense, control can't be a thing. It's like the idea that we could conditionalize anything in the universe to some sort of absolute degree, such that the universe itself can't participate in, is just bogus. It's just not a thing. So we have degrees of influence. We can be in relationship, we can be in the flow, we can be in choice, and we can certainly engage with causation. But again, in the sense that causation is not going to be 100% deterministic ever. That the notion of will, of compelling something to happen, is just it's a false concept. So for all of these reasons, to talk about free and to talk about will, and then to combine these as if it's going to make some sort of magical meaningfulness in the sense of what we experience subjectively, is just, again, most philosophers look at this and find that notion to be completely incoherent. But usually they just stop at that point. They say, well, since choice and decision and free will are all the same thing, that therefore we have just rejected the notion of consciousness as having any influence on physical reality at all. And, staying with Descartes, that separation between mind and body is such that, having just disproven mind as a causal influence in the universe, therefore we can basically say that consciousness, if anything, is an epiphenomenon. And of course, this is all just junk, because it stems from a premise of separation and not the relationship as a unifying force in the first place. So this is largely part of the reason why, for example, that the metaphysics doesn't start with Cartesian separation as a premise. It starts with you have dualism as a sort of philosophical premise, and then you have physical monism. We just made that same transition because it's the same argument, i.e. that there's mind and body, and then they say, well, mind isn't anything, so we're going to let go of that. We just disproven you can't observe mind, and so therefore it isn't real, or it doesn't exist. And again, it's very slippery because they use these languages as kind of interchangeable, but they're not. So they end up overgeneralizing and proving too much. And so in effect, what ends up happening is that we end up having the idea that the physical universe is everything, and that humanity and machinery and nature are all the same, and therefore we might as well just do whatever we want. And there's no such thing as want. We're all just machinery playing out in chemistry, and so there's no morality and there's no ethics to really think about. And of course, the whole thing goes out to some desacralized hedonism. with all the excesses of the universe as humanity currently thinks it's currently in place. But if we start from a different set of premises, the idea of foundational triplication and type isomorphism might need that, there's always these three sets of concepts at the basis of any domain, and that we can understand the relationship between these concepts in a way that's applicable to every domain, then it becomes possible to hold the notion of choice as being equal co-participant as the notion of causation and the notion of change. And that from this emerges an entirely different way of thinking about life, the universe, and everything. And that from that, we can actually start to have tools that would allow us to say, yes, choice is real, but it's just not the same as decision. It's not the same as free will. And of course, between the three of those, I'd rather have choice than anything else. So in this sense, there's just, again, I'm connecting these concepts to a whole bunch of other arguments in history and in time, and trying to sort of show how my holding of it is a little different than other holdings of this have been in the past.
Yeah,
it's a little different at first and a lot different in the end, basically.
Yeah, I'm still trying to understand this, and so let me just kind of say a little bit how I'm understanding. Right, there's consciousness, right? Or there's like there's the will of the universe or of consciousness of everything, and consciousness is somehow orienting to that will and choosing it in perfect ways, but somehow coming to to a better choice altogether through right, through wrong, through mistakes, through the imperfection, somehow coming to a higher level of perfection or a higher level of truth. Am I on the right track? Like because I'm really trying to get this. I'm trying to get this.
Okay, there's ways to get there using the ingredients you just gave. So in the same sort of way, we can think of the universe as the totality of the objective. And maybe we can think about divinity as being the totality of the subjective. That in a certain way, we can think about the relationship between the objective and the subjective. Right? That the relationship between the objective and the subjective is the place where choice, change, and causation live. And so, in effect, change is what's happening in the relationship just in general. And if the flow seems to be from the subjective towards the objective, we call it choice as a way of conditionalizing a little bit about why change is that way. And if the flow is from the world to the self, or from the objective to the subjective, then we describe that change in causal terms. Right? So in effect, causation would be a perspective that the subjective has about patterns in the objective. And choice would be essentially sort of an emergence into the objective of patterns that are happening in the subjective, but are invisible for being that. So in this specific sense, we could talk about better choices in a sense as connecting a larger volume of the subjective to a larger volume in the object. But really, that's a realization of the integrity of the connection. Right? It's an increase in the integrity of the connection. So in this sense, we could say that the more that there is integrity in the connection between the subjective and the objective, as expressed in choice or in causation, right? In the sense that we more correctly perceive causation, or we're more correctly in the flow of connecting self-subjective to universe, that the larger the scope and the span of those connections, the higher the integrity of those connections, the more that they have truth, the more that they have goodness, and the more that they have beauty. If I'm thinking about it in the sense of goodness, I'm thinking about it in the sense of, sort of an innate quality as held in the sense of the sort of microscopic nature of something. If I'm thinking about truth, I'm thinking about it as a sort of macroscopic kind of perspective, an overarching sense of, okay, I have this whole model and I'm connecting a lot of this to a lot of this. That's an overview perspective, right? Whereas in a sense, the goodness is going to be about the interior essence of something. Right? It's good to its core, right? When we say, we have a good soul, it's about the interior. And then when we're looking at beauty, we're looking at it in a sense of passion or a sense of connection itself. It's in the first person relationship. And it comes out of a sort of transcendent way of thinking. We think about beauty as essentially a reflection of something that is, first beyond understanding, but then experienced in the first person relationship. I don't necessarily know everything about all the reasons why the sunset is the shape that it is, why that cloud is there, or why that particular hue might depend upon all sorts of factors I don't know. But on the other hand, those factors combine to create an experience of a beautiful sunset that that I can experience firsthand and notice as beauty. So in that sense, we can think about the relationship between truth, good, and beautiful in terms of the dynamics of the relationship between self and reality, in terms of the immanent, the omniscient, the transcendent. So in this sense, the tool set is largely a way of helping us to make better choices, but also to know sort of the places where, we kind of need the assistance of both theoretical constructs and sometimes other people, or connection to the world or connection to spirit, in order for that to really be felt as a good choice, or as a choice affirming of truth, or as a choice that is creating a beauty. And so in this specific sense, it's like, again, it has to do with the amount of presence or the amount of willingness to engage in the present moment in an authentic way.
Yeah, I'm gonna come back to this and watch it like 3 times and try to see if I could piece it together.
It'll make more and more sense as you ask questions. I can trace more of how you're holding it, and use that language to try to help make it easier for you to get from where you are to where I'm sort of leading to, I guess.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid to ask. I mean, it helps me to know how to contextualize this better.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I just got so many questions, so I wanna actually move to spirituality and religion.
Uh-huh.
And how does your understanding of spirituality and religion contrast? How do you think about them?
So this is a sort of, so first of all, I'm just going to hold the word spirituality and religion without any kind of pejorative character, without any kind of judgment, because sometimes people experience religion as essentially a bad thing, experiencing collective action abuse or various kinds of historical phenomena that have resulted in conflict. So I'm not holding that, but I am holding that religion is essentially an experience in community, and spirituality is an experience in self, right? So in effect, when we're talking about spirituality, we're talking about essentially a capacity on the part of a person to have all sorts of experiences of great pain or great joy or just intensity of one sort or another, and still maintain the integrity of oneself. So in this sense, spirituality is a quality or a strength that one has to be able to remain whole, remain in integrity, even in the face of strong forces in life. Really difficult or positive experiences that sometimes would lead a person to move out of integrity. Like maybe they're so successful that whatever their personality flaws all of a sudden get magnified and amplified into some sort of disablement, right? Addiction and things like that. Or so painful that they fracture, they become, dissociated or multiple selves or things like that. So in the sense that trauma is a kind of loss of integrity, right? So it's essentially the past defining how one responds in the present. That there's a notion that spirituality is essentially the realization of cure for this sort of thing. It's like, what are the skills that help us to basically be able to be fully present in the moment as a whole and integral being, as a complete self. Whereas when we're talking about religion, we're talking about essentially community. Like I don't think that the notion of religion makes sense without thinking of it as a kind of community. And I think similarly that anywhere that there's community, where there's people that care for one another, there's a language and a culture that goes with that, and to some extent that can be described as a sort of religious principle. But so, is there any community that's not a religion, or is there any religion that's not a community? I think not. So in that sense, I tend to use those words more or less interchangeably. But now and of course I need to specify this because most people wouldn't know that unless I just told them. So then there's a sense of which, as we are looking to talk about interior integrity in the sense of spirituality, we can now talk about community integrity. Like, how strong is the community? How strong are the relationships of care? Are they able to integrate all sorts of, people and circumstances and be able to navigate that with grace? That the right things can happen more often than not. That relationships endure, and that the connections of communication are holding, and that the agreements actually make sense. And so, in this sense, the notion of community as being about the relational integrity or the agreement integrity or the communication integrity among a body of people, even when people come and go, for example, then now we have this sort of beautiful mirror image of integrity in the external sense is what we call religion, and integrity in the interior sense is what we call spirituality. And they're both measures of strength. they're defined in terms of strength rather than power. And that's, again, power would be, something that needs to be demonstrated to, a force that overcomes a distance, overcomes a resistance in a given inverse in time, right? The smaller the time, the more the force, and the greater the resistance that's overcome, the more powerful it is. But strength can be essentially an idea of, despite many oncoming forces, that it remains the same. It's not making a change, overcoming a resistance, and therefore different. It's staying the same even despite all sorts of incoming forces. And rather than being inverse in time, it's, the longer the time that it can do that, the stronger. So strength isn't demonstrated so much. It's just sort of a capacity to endure and to maintain integrity, basically, to remain whole as oneself. The usual metaphor being, a single branch break, but a whole collection of branches not break, right? So that sense of, pushing as hard as I can, but it doesn't break the branches. The branches don't change. They stay the same shape, or at least close to the same shape. They return to the same shape. In that sense, we can start to, really understand these concepts as being applicable to, what sort of things would be good for community or good for spirituality. And a lot of principles come from that. Like in physics, for example, or something called Young's modulus, is the stress versus strain ratio, for example, or that sort of, to what degree does an oncoming pressure result in an underlying deformation? And so, in a sense, we can think about trauma in that same sort of way, and the use of let's say, psychedelic substances as a method of creating enough plasticity to cure trauma, for example, and why that would want to be held in a community context rather than in just an individual context, and why we would want to help those in a sacred way rather than a non-sacred way. So all these things connect. There's a huge amount of interleave of how these concepts come together. So in that sense, when we're thinking about spirituality and religion, we can identify a few basic litmus tests. For example, if it has a name, it's in community. Therefore, it's a religion. If it doesn't have a name, more likely to be a spirituality or about spirituality. So, flat out, if it's something that can be communicated, it's more likely to be part of religion. Not always, but more generally. I mean, I can point to interior integrity and stuff like that, but just the more that I formalize it, the more likely it's going to become a cultural artifact of some sort. So that's roughly the way in which the two notions of spirituality and religion are held within the way I think of things. There are adjacent concepts. Obviously, there's science and technology, which are different than these. And there's a couple of other concepts which come up in this context as well, but may or may not be worth mentioning at this point.
Yeah, you also say that spirituality is how you integrate the world within yourself,
right,
and religion is how you integrate yourself into the world.
Yeah.
And there, I think I've also had this kind of, bad taste in my mouth when it came to religion, like seeing religion as, dogmatic teachings. And I think that's kind of the dominant definition. And now I just see like religion as a way to integrate spirituality, a way to, if I had a spiritual experience, I had a certain experience, how should I live now? Or how should I come together in community and say, we've had these spiritual experiences? How do we integrate them together? And then, I'm also thinking about, you speak a lot about the meaning crisis and like how the sense of religion is in some way has collapsed, or we've started creating these new religions, but it seems like that's part of the meaning crisis, because it's like there's something about like religion and community being in a sense one thing, and it's like the way that we look at religion and just allowing it to collapse. It's like we're allowing this cohesiveness, this tying back to collapse, and that's kind of part of the reason, that's part of the cause of the meaning crisis.
I can definitely speak to that in a way that I think will tie a lot of that together. So, the part of the reason I was fairly careful in the beginning to sort of say I'm not holding these in a pejorative way is to partially open up some space to just even talk about this. But religion as a community process, or as a process of managing communities, of course, one of the ways in which that ends up becoming a thing, like any other sort of governance architecture, is going to be taboos and political structures and power structures of hierarchical organizations and things like that. And of course, over time, as the more charismatic people end up becoming more and more agentic with respect to what they want to have happen or what they believe should happen based upon whatever happens to be the philosophy du jour. That in that sense, there's an increasing in time, just likelihood that religion would be misused not for community's sake, but for political aims of one sort or another. And we can talk about corruption issues and just the fact that that's a thing that happens in any kind of governance architecture unless there's like really specific dynamics put in place to prevent that. And of course that's like a whole conversation. What does good governance look like, and how does that work? But the idea here is that when we're thinking about it in the modern context, and by that I mean roughly this century, we can kind of look back and we can see, okay, well, once you had this sort of perspective of living with nature and living with change, and then we had the enlightenments, quote unquote, the enlightenment of the discovery of causation and realization that we could use causation to figure out how to do all sorts of things. And science and technology at this point have provided us with a huge amount of options. It tells us what we can do. We can do all sorts of things. And it's like, when new technological discovery is happening, it's essentially a discovery of new kinds of things you can do, new products and services and so on. But this is where the ethics connects back to it, is that when you had religion basically serving as a cultural basis, then the values of that community were encoded in the morality of that religion. And so for instance, when choices were being made about what can we do, it could be asked what should we do, and the notion of what should we do could connect back to values that's embodied within those moral codes. But when in effect causation basically was treated as the basis of knowledge, then we did this sort of canceling thing. We basically threw out the entire package of religion, not just the claims that it was making about causal phenomena, which probably weren't that great. There were heuristics that worked in some circumstances, but weren't really analyzed or thought of in the sort of detail that the early scientists were starting to discover was really helpful. And so, in a sense, it's like, well, since their knowledge about causation is terrible, their knowledge about values must be equally bad. So as a result, we're going to toss the whole deal. And this basically means that now we have this sense of just not knowing what our values are, like flat out. We're not consulting with the community anymore to decide what the community wants. We're effectively just sort of trying to tell it what to do, using some sort of nudging phenomena or flat out dictatorship or hierarchical media marketing campaigns of one sort or another. And obviously, when the community is not being consulted about its values and things are being done to it, and the degree to which that sense of the category of group conflict over the minority, for example, is going to be elevated quite a bit. This is why I call it collective action abuse. And so, in this sense, there is an increasing detachment from the purposes and the values, and therefore the meaningfulness. And the notion of the sacred as being meaningful, or being a way in which we could make choices about what we should do. There's the mountain. Yes, we can climb it, but should we? And is that actually a good use of our time? Is that a good use of the mountain? What does the mountain think about that? I mean, obviously these sorts of questions sound a little nonsensical, but on the other hand, there's a sense here in which we really do need to look at not sort of the utilitarian basis for our choices, but as a sense of embodied value. And somewhere along the way, we have to ground the notion of goodness as like what is the notion of goodness going to connect to? It's not an abstraction. It's connected back to embodied value. And so, one of the critiques that I sort of have about, say, the effective altruism movement is that it doesn't really understand the notion of value at all. It understands utilitarianism, which is an abstract notion of value. It's a virtual notion of value, but it doesn't touch reality in any way. So, you can kind of get into all of these intellectual games of the greatest good for the greatest number, and then discover you have no way of measuring that. And by the way, consciousness isn't the thing at all, and neither is time. So, what the hell is this notion of greatest good for the greatest number even mean? And at that point, it becomes detached, and the notion of effective altruism goes away. Whereas if you're looking for, altruism as grounded in a real sense, in some sort of embodied sense, you're talking about, I'm not just going to make choices on behalf of myself, that I or my first circle of concern, my friends and family and people that I know on a first name basis, that I'm going to care about more than that. I'm going to care about the community. I'm going to care about maybe the the whole species, like humanity in general, or I care about the ecosystem, and not to have my cares essentially either at a personal level or just a patriotic level. In other words, either used by myself or used by some political body, but actually be genuinely affirming of the well-being of life, the well-being of the world, which is in the larger context of the universe, incredibly unique. So astoundingly unique that the value of this world is really seriously, largely under recognized. Think like a trillion dollars unrecognized. Not even in that. That is an understatement. It's like I did some analysis. It's another article on the my favorite love blog, mflb.com site, that basically is pointing to the value of the world as being something like $1 quadrillion dollars. At which point the total economic product of the entire planet, every transaction of the entire planet, if we're making choices on the basis of economic value, but the value of this earth is so much larger than that literally the entire economic process of all of human history over all of time doesn't even show up as a rounding error. Then we're largely not very good at making choices on the basis of even economic value. So in this sense, we really need to get better at making choices. But the idea here about how religion is basically because it didn't reflect causal knowledge, and the notion that choice can only be understood in causation, which is totally wrong. I mean, you have to understand choice in terms of choice the same way you understand causation in terms of causation. No amount of understanding of causation is going to tell you anything about the nature of good choice. So we as a modern world have basically thrown away religion. We've thrown away community. We've thrown away the value of value itself. We've substituted abstract value, financial instruments, NFTs and cryptocurrencies and Ethereum and all this other kind of stuff as being the way in which we hold value in community. But it's all bullshit. It's like the notion of value is never going to be something that's abstract. It's always going to land as something embodied. It's going to land as something concrete in life. And so in this specific sense, if we're wanting to make better choices, to some extent, we need to actually distinguish between what we can do and what we should do. And what we should do is going to want to be connected to something that's not causal. It's going to be connected to the values of life and the values of community and values of relationship and connectedness interiorly, exteriorly to the world and exteriorly to other people. And how well are we actually, in service to that, in devotion to that? How strong is our care? How well are we holding care? And the more that we substitute transactionalism for care, the more that we substitute science for religion, or make other category mistakes like spirituality and religion as being the same thing, and so on, the less effective we're going to be at making good choices. So, given that the circumstances of the world require us to make really good choices, it's actually quite helpful to understand the notion of meaningfulness as distinct from, say, value and purpose, and to recognize that in a very profound way that meaningfulness is more fundamental than both value and purpose. So we need to get back to the notion of what is ultimately meaningful. The notion of the sacred as that which is ultimately meaningful is incredibly relevant here. Like, what does it mean when we say that something's sacred? We say it's ultimately meaningful. It's like more meaningful than we even know how to say. And so, in this sense, when we sort of connect the dots and we say, well, the value of this world is beyond, even in gross macroeconomic senses, anything that we can really point to in terms of, our own understanding of macroeconomic process, or moreover that, there's a notion of life and unicity in this universe that is really being upheld here. That to some extent we need to have our choices be in reflection to that our altruism needs to be in reflection of that. To think that choices are to be made by selves for individual self-benefit is something that can be done by a species that's a minority species on the planet. It's certainly not a species that has essentially entangled itself with the entire ecosystem. At this particular point, we can no longer make choices on a selfish basis. We can no longer make choices on a win-lose basis, that's for sure. The game theory itself doesn't go anywhere near far enough. We're looking at the design of things, and not an omniscient top-down will design, but a sort of from the middle towards the edges type of design. Evolution would be designed from the microscopic, and modern engineering would be designed from the macroscopic. But I'm talking about something called transcendent design, which is essentially a design from everywhere at once, or a design that is essentially, in one sense it can be thought of as emergent, but it's emergent out of the present and into the past and future. So in this sense, there's a really deep notion here of, life is meaningful, and that in fact there is no meaningfulness that is not alive, and there's no aliveness that is not meaningful. And so in that sense, we're now starting to understand altruism as that which moves beyond just our own life to the totality of all life, and to have our choices be reflective of that continuum, the whole continuum of that, as a way of upholding things. And so now we're starting to show connection between spirituality and religion, and that this is actually the basis upon which we need to be making choices about what we should do. What are the principles of effective choice? And how can we uphold the goodness and the beauty of the truth all at the same time? And so this is, at this particular point, although I'm not particularly wanting to sanction, a specific religion against the horrors of the past, but on the other hand, to basically get back down to sort of basic truths. This is again what Tantra is about. Like, get back to the principles. Like all of these religions, one fashion or another, they emerged out of a sort of mystic understanding, or kind of perspective that just had a much deeper level of inclusiveness. That the spirituality of a person acted as a kind of as a stillness through which one could sense what was under the surface of the water. By being perfectly still, I can sense the motions of the fish by the ripples they make. And so in this sense, I can be much more aware of the ways in which choices become cooperative, and the ways in which we can actually be in right balance in the process of how we think about the choices that we're making individually and collectively. And this, of course, is crucially important at this time.
So I want to go in a different direction real quick. I know we're getting a little short on time, but there was a profound conversation that you had with John Vervaeke, and I'm not sure if you remember this. It was probably like a year ago. And there was a point in the conversation that really struck me, and I just want to go back to it, and maybe you'll be able to remember it. So I'm just going to kind of, say what you guys were saying, what you guys were talking about, and see what comes up for you. But in this part of the conversation, you say, words that I'm using, they're terms of the typology of a kind of hyper mathematics, right at it's a conceptual mathematics. And then John says, you're trying to get to, a grounding relationship between ethics and ontology. I appreciate that. And I think that in itself is fundamental. You say, can I say something that might sound incredibly egotistic? Yes, I'm not looking for it. I found it. I know for a fact it's done. It's like, it's intense. It's really intense, but it emerges a lot of really beautiful stuff. And you go on to say, and to make this specific claim was because you talked about it as a relationship between ethics and ontology. I'm basically saying it's not just a relationship between ethics and ontology. John says, how would you characterize it then? You say it's a relationship between ethics, ontology, and epistemology. In other words, it's a structure that is at once all of these things and none of them, in the sense that it is a deeper basis from which all three emerge. So in effect, when I say I know something, I'm not making an opinion. I'm basically saying this because the nature of epistemology itself is wrapped into the nature of ethics and ontology directly. So my understanding of this is that through developing your metaphysics, you've discovered some kind of fundamental order that lies behind reality. May I say it's as if you discovered God. If you remember this conversation, what would you
remember that part very specifically?
Yeah, when you were saying that, to me, that was almost like a climax, because I felt your energy and your passion and your conviction. So I'm wondering, like, what have you discovered, and how has this understanding transformed you?
The what part is the axioms and the modalities, and how it's transformed me. Wow. I don't know if there's any part of my, there's a sort of irony in that question. And part of it is that, like, when we're looking at the relationship between the subjective and the objective, right? The relationship as a kind of interaction, as a perception. So I can talk about perceiver, perceived, and perceiving. At first, these are held as if they are concepts, as if they're ideas. And instead of calling it metaphysics, I could have called it, meta concepts. meta causation or meta causation is not quite right, but meta conceptual. And that there's a sense in which at first we experience the metaphysics, the axioms and the modalities as if they're abstractions. We have these triples and there's all sorts of them and they all connect together, and we can sort of use the understanding of one triple in one domain to better understand that another triple in another domain, and the axioms sort of characterize those patterns and so on. But at a certain point, you come to notice it's challenging to speak of, but you come to notice that you can't regard the concepts of the subjective and the objective. It's your subjective and the now objective. And that the relationship of perception as a process is basically that all is process. There is no such thing as there's no such thing as a thing. That all is process, and that the process itself is essentially characterized by axiom 2. That our thinking about it is essentially characterized by axiom 1. And that the transfusiveness of it, the sense in which it is at the ground of all things, is the axiom 3 concept, the very notion of triple itself, foundational triplication happening. And so in this sense, these are no longer abstractions. You discover them to be very, very real in the very, very notion of your experience of the here and now in its most primal sense. Right? The concept of process as being, connecting doing and becoming. Right? The being is more fundamental than doing and becoming, but we can think about and talk about doing. It's observable. In the same sort of sense that which we perceive is observable, but the perceiver and the perceiving, not observable. So I can't perceive the perceiving and I can't perceive the perceiver. So of the totality of what is, only 1/3 of which is discussable, is pointable, is objective enough to be constructed into forms and shapes, and therefore the content of dialogue. In effect, it's like I remember one time I was approaching Bowdoin College Library in Maine, and I was really enthusiastic about doing some research and looking at that, and then I had this thought. It was like, but the only things I can study in a library is the kind of stuff that can be written down in books, and that maybe there's a certain kind of knowing, a certain kind of knowledge that just doesn't have enough structure. It just isn't about structure, so therefore it can't be written down in books. It just can't be described in language at all. And without trying to get all mystical or seem all, kind of spiritual about it or ephemeral or anything, it's just that it turns out that there are some kinds of things that are in the very nature of the process. I'm reminded of Descartes. So his program was, he's basically in prison wanting something to do. And so being a philosophical character, he basically said, all right, I'm gonna do this exercise. This exercise is, I'm going to take as true only those things about which I have no doubts. And I'm going to be really broad about what it means to have a doubt. I'm going to basically say, if I can have any doubt about it, even conceptually, I'm going to take it as potentially not true and therefore not true for the purposes of trying to find out those things about which I can have no doubts, about which it's impossible to have doubt. And so, that was his method for trying to identify capital T truth, those things which are not able to be doubted, therefore must be true in some sort of non-contingent sense. And this program is kind of an interesting program. It's great that somebody did this, right? So in a sense, he goes through this meditation. It takes him a few years, and he arrives at this thing. I think, therefore I am. I.e., that the process of thinking and the process of being have become the same. That any interruption of one is the interruption of the other. And so in this sense, the notion of the most elemental sense of I perceive is the most elemental sense of I am. Right? And this is a great thing. A lot of people have gotten really into this and thought that this was it. This is quote unquote the subjective capital T truth. And it's interesting. He actually missed a whole other category. Um, Anything which is intrinsic to the nature of doubt can't be doubted. Right? He was trying to basically use doubt as a tool, but the tool itself has a process. It is a process, right? I'm going to check. Can I doubt something? And doubt as a process has intrinsics. Comparison has intrinsics. It has characteristics that are essential as part and parcel of that concept. You can't have that concept without these other concepts sort of being dragged along, right? And so, in this sense, the intrinsics of doubt can't be doubted, because if I attempted to doubt them, I'd be instantiating them. I.e., if I was to have doubt about doubt, I would have taken doubt with me in the process of having doubt. And the things I can't take with me, I can't doubt, because they're always going to be there in the very action of having doubt in itself. So therefore, they can't be doubted. Right? Neat little trick, that. So when we sort of notice this, we can basically say, well, what are the intrinsics of doubt, right? Like, those things must be pretty important. And it turns out that they are the same kinds of things that were identified, and I think, therefore I am, which is part of the reason why these things are recognizable as being profound. So in that sense, I can't hold that the notion of perception and the notion of identity are distinct. Right? I have to treat them as essentially aligned concepts. And I also have to recognize, given the reality of what can be perceived, right? The perceived is perceivable, but the perception and the perceiver aren't. But I now have to make explicit adjustments to my conceptual process to account for those things as being real, even though they are not visible. They are aspects of the process of visioning, of seeing. And so in this specific sense, when we start to make corrections and really start to take in these ideas and work with them with at this particular point, some degree of carefulness, right? Some degree of real discernment and real discipline, that we can begin to notice that, these aren't just concepts. They are things that are living in the very perception of the perceptions I'm having right now, that I cannot not see them. I cannot see with them. So it's not the abstract notion of being, it is the actual notion of being. And it's not the abstract notion of how do I know, it's the process of knowing itself. And in the sense that there's a sense of connectedness in that, and a wanting to maintain integrity around the process of perception that is emerging out of that process, not some sort of integrity from the outside in, but from the inside out, that I can't not have care. It can't not matter. It can't not be meaningful. The notion of meaningfulness, the notion of knowing, the notion of being are all the same. And so in this sense, there's sort of a kind of capitulation of what is the topic of metaphysics. In one sense, I describe it as the relationship between the subjective and the objective, and an inquiry into the very nature of that relationship, which of course is what we're realizing. But also the deep questions like, what is, how do we know, and why should we care? Because we do care, and we do know, and we are, right? And so in this sense, there's a sort of fundamentalness that emerges in the characterization of the axioms and the modalities that is not, it's not contingent on something other than itself. The axioms and the modalities can and do describe themselves. And this, of course, has been treated as a mark of a really good metaphysics, or a really good body of mathematics, is that it can be self-describing. And this has been known mostly to deep practitioners, i.e. maybe a dozen or so people in the world at any given moment. But the idea is that not only is that the case, that it can be describing of itself, because it's about process. Right? There's something really unique in the sense that in being about process, the axioms and modalities is being a description of process, that it's not only the case that it describes itself, it describes the process of describing itself. And this is a whole other order. It's like it changes the nature of what it means to understand. It changes the nature of what it means to be, and how we know what we are to care about. So in that sense, I've experienced that feeling, that thinking, that sense directly, right? There's no moment in which I can have doubt about it, because the very process, as in the same sense I was connecting earlier of trying to question it effectively instantiates it. Like it's like at this particular point, being in possession of these tools, the tools themselves as being the very same tools of logic and of reason, and deeper than that, right? They are the tools that uphold the very basis of what we mean to be logical or reasonable. Like the idea itself of knowing is in a sense upheld by these things. So in effect, what ends up happening is that whatever method you're using, in empiricism in the sense of firsthand experience, or logic and reason as a sort of analytic approach, or some sort of mysticism, that the result either way ends up being undeniable, and that continually happens. Like it's like first person all the time, and so in that specific sense, I mean, on one hand, it's like everything is exactly the way it has always been. There's, it's like, before and after, exactly the same experiences, except that the way in which we're holding those experiences has been completely changed. The context of how I bring myself into my self life is not at all the same. So there's nothing that you can point to, but the experience of life has become quite surreal. It becomes actually quite difficult to convey, and the kinds of things which we would normally think of, like I can knock on the wall, for example, and so on and so forth, and people think that that's solid and that it has, that it's quite concrete and that it can be discussed quite easily, and that things like metaphysics are very ephemeral and very hard to talk about. Spiritual concepts are quite difficult to speak on. My experience is the exact inverse of this. The things which were once described as completely ephemeral to me feel extremely concrete, like way easier to hold and to be held by. And things which we would normally treat as objects or events or stuff that ordinarily would think to be quite concrete becomes to me very ephemeral. So there's this sense of liminality that results, and in that sense, I have definitely been changed. If I had somehow constructed a time machine and went back in time and told myself then what I now know to be the case, I would be. It's so incredible. It's so beyond my wildest expectations of anything I could hope to have achieved. The younger self that was making a vow to be in devotion to larger causes of life and ecosystem and so on, of the wildness of nature, would not have anticipated that the willingness to be transformed, to accept whatever it would take to get to an understanding or a sort of knowing. I was intensely curious, and the devotion is real. And so in effect, there's a sense in which one is willing to do whatever it takes to be and to become whatever it takes. And that only in the totality of that commitment does that transformation actually happen.
Yeah, like listening to you talk, there was so many moments where it seemed like you were getting very emotional.
Yeah.
And it's like very moving, and like, I can't completely grasp what you're saying. I could kind of get a sense, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but to me, it's almost like, it's like God is speaking to us, or speaking through us, or as us, or the universe is speaking through us. Like, that's the sense that I get. That's like the sense of sacredness or divinity that I get through you speaking. And it's almost like John Vervaeke, I think, speaks about like using philosophy as a form of spiritual practice. And it seems like that's what you did. Like, that was your spiritual practice of like actually using metaphysics and using philosophy and like thinking and sitting in, I don't know how many hours and how much time alone you spent like
A lot.
getting to this. Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and I can feel, right? Like, I can't exactly grasp a lot of the things you speak about, like your intelligence, and coming up to this conversation, this is like the most I felt like almost like intimidated, because I'm like, this guy is just so intelligent, and the things that he speaks about are so profound, and I want to be able to keep up with it and understand it, and have a conversation with you. But there's definitely, like, I can feel it. You know what I'm saying? It's not something that I could even understand, but there's this sense of, like I get this sense of deep ethics, of deep care, of deep meaningfulness that, when I read your work and when I hear you speak. So yeah, just something very profound in what you're realizing. And I think anybody watching this and just listening to you speak can sense that, even if they can't intellectually grasp what you're saying, they can feel it.
Yeah, well, the trust of the intuition and the feeling is a good thing. I think that there's a sense in which there's a deep intelligence in our bodies and our being, and this is to any degree to which we are ourselves a reflection of life, that we can be in a holding of that sacred as well. And so in this sense, it's interesting. You refer to divinity a few times. I think of the notions of immanent, omniscient, and transcendent as partly being a reflection of ways in which we can hold the notion of the divine, hold the notion of the sacred, right? The immanent is the first person sense, and these are what would normally be thought of as earth-centered spirituality, or sort of pagan ways of experiencing that. When we think about, say, the Old Testament kind of ways of thinking about it, of divinity as being a sort of judgmental or jealous God of sorts, that's the kind of omniscient way of thinking about divinity as just that sort of historical sense. And then you have what has become this notion of a loving God, like a divinity of a more feminine character, perhaps, where it's a nurturing, love that is upholding all of creation, from the bounty from which the beauty of life emerges. That created the universe in however long, that sort of notion of creatrix is maybe a more transcendent way of thinking about divinity. And in this particular sense, the metaphysics would make the seemingly outrageous claim to actually think about the cycle and flow of these ways of proceeding, of essentially talking about creation in the sense of as evolution would hold it, right? That evolution acts as a creative force, or the technology holds it as a creative process. I.e., we make new things, right? We build stuff, and as our choices would make things, that we partially build and create the world through our choices, and that in this sense, as an embodiment of the divine, like one religion sort of describes it as being made in His image, and the way that I hold that, or the way that I feel that, or sense the sort of truthiness in that, is that in the same sort of way that any creative act involves a selection of all possibilities into one actuality, that the choices are a selection of possible things you could do into the thing you do. And so in that sense, our choices are creative. They are part of creation, the same way that existence is a basis for causation, that the creation is a basis for choice. And that to some extent, this is part of the reason why we can't really understand choice using scientific methods, because science is going to study that which is observable and repeatable. But we've noticed from things we were saying earlier that 2/3 of what isn't observable. And anything that has a creative nature is certainly not going to be repeatable, right? The very essence of saying that it's creative is to talk about things in the sense that goes beyond creation, it goes beyond repeatability, rather. And so in this sort of holding of process, we are needing to become much more skillful in terms of allowing that cycle to continue, to not just get stuck in one mode of relationship, first person, third person sort of overview, or this sort of meditative second person transcendent sort of way of looking at things. And that again, this is going to go around, and in each of our lives, we are always going to be involved in this dynamic. This is the nature of being and doing and becoming. And so, in this sense, we are really looking at the ways in which all of this ties together, and treating that as a kind of infusion, as a kind of suffusiveness in terms of our process of I wouldn't just say building a better world, but essentially becoming co-participants in the divinity of life.
This has been a profound conversation that's stretched my mind, just like all of your works. I'm curious, where's the best place for people to connect with you? Is it mflb.com?
Yeah, mflb.com. I've been calling it my favorite love blog, or my friendly.
Is that you? Did you add that? Because it was because I know MFLB is Magic Flight Launchbox. I also noticed that you got the FL, the Forrest Landry in the middle, the initials.
Well, I had people confused. Like, so for instance, I cringe a little bit because the business was, it was kind of an experiment. It was a cultural experiment, and it was a way for me to test the philosophy and really try out some of these things in an applied way. And I didn't think that I was going to get a chance to really speak to civilization design issues, but I figured that in that company or in that context, that at least I'd have a chance to try. And I learned a lot. I really did. I mostly have learned that communities and institutions, or communities and businesses, are just, you're not going to make one or the other. And the idea is, at this point, I'm now focused much more on community and less on business. But I had this 4-letter domain website, and I would have preferred to have associated with the business, but for a variety of reasons and technical reasons, it just didn't work out that way. And so I had this thing, I needed to publish a bunch of stuff, so it just was easier to stick there. And then over time, it was kind of like, well, I don't, it was originally listed as the Magic Flight Library of Books. There's a lot of books, but they're not directly available on the site itself. I mean, there are some hidden, if you have a login, you can get to a few things, but for the most part, I just didn't get a chance to put all the books up. And so, it was a renaming that enabled me to dissociate, but then people thought of it as a publication arm for Magic Flight. And it was like, well, in one sense it is, but Magic Flight is the secondary thing. This is actually the primary thing. So then I had to sort of reorient to rename it in a way that people could understand. No, this is actually a blog where I'm publishing my work. Like, I'm trying to help people to have a place to find where my things are. And again, there's a lot of technical things that are happening. For one thing, it's not listed on Google. So if you go search for me, you won't find a site. But if you do happen to be in the liminal web and are part of that community, then you can get to it. And now it's clear from the front that this is actually my blog. And, just basically a place that I've just been posting things to try to make it easier for people to understand stuff. And there's a lot more that needs to be posted. I need a lot of help. And then it's just, a question of integrating all that and putting it up in some way that makes sense. But then there's the whole, the whole process of just what are the ways that people can get in touch with me. So we've created there's a Zoom group that meets on Wednesdays, today being the day. So at 4:30 and basically a little less than an hour from now, in 50 minutes from this time, basically there's going to be there's a Zoom link on the front page of the website. So if you click on that and it's 4:30 Pacific time on a Wednesday, then I can answer questions if people have them. I try to be pretty concise about it, but that's a place that I've been showing up and holding office hours effectively. So that's kind of where you can go for more information and how you can get in touch with me personally. There are other ways if you're in the network of people. I at this particular point, there's a lot of incoming curiosity and interest in this material, and I'm trying to find ways to provide that to people without necessarily overloading myself in the process. So there's some balances around that.
Yeah, I like that you shared about I was curious about like the idea behind the business. I like how you shared that it was actually just an experiment, and life is crazy. Universe is crazy because I don't know how many years ago this was. Over a decade, maybe more, where I had one of these Magic Flight Launchboxes, and I was smoking from this vaporizer, and I clearly remember this vaporizer because it was so different and distinct in the fact that it was wooden, and all other vaporizers, most of them were plastic or glass or something else, but this one was wooden, and it was just something very unique about it. And 10 years later, 50, whatever it was, I come across your work and I find out that you're actually the one who created this. And now I'm sitting here having a podcast with you, on a completely different wave than I was before. So it's just, that's kind of mind blowing and profound to me.
Well, the business partially, I mean, you'll notice on the backside of every one of these things is this aphorism: love is that which enables choice. Love is always stronger than fear. Always choose on the basis of love. So I actually treated the company partially as a sense of how much can I shift the market? Like, can I actually have people really take in a notion like that, and how well does it help people? I mean, I thought that would be the most useful thing that I could communicate for people to really understand. And I still believe that to a large extent. Like, it's the simplest single thing. That if this is the only thing that you ever learn from anything that I've ever learned, this is the thing I believe would be the most helpful ultimately. Obviously, the axioms are more powerful in a real profound sense, but if it's at an individual level and I can only stick it in this little space, what would that message be? And so, yeah, the company's been around for 12 years, 13, going on 14 years, really, I guess. And yeah, it was very much a reconnection to my roots, and as a woodworker and as a person that really enjoys and appreciates good craft. I don't know how many philosophers make things with their hands or have ever actually tested their work in business, but to do that is and to have been successful is to have essentially demonstrated the validity of the metaphysics in a way that most armchair philosophers I don't think ever really do. And so I would hope that people would take it a little more seriously because of that. But in a lot of respects, it's also been kind of an exercise in humility because knowing that it's a business that's in support of cannabis enthusiasts, for example, people would say, well, therefore the business owner is a cannabis enthusiast, and I am in favor of herbalism because it connects back to life. I don't really single out cannabis particularly, but obviously everybody does. So there's a sense in which there's now this really easy dismissal that anybody in the academic community can say, oh, he's just dumb, and therefore just completely dismiss everything else. And on one hand, that's been a little bit of a relief because it means I don't have to deal with too many intellectuals. I can deal with real people who tend to make that mistake a lot less. But on the other hand, it also means that the academic community has more or less ignored almost everything in this space, which is fine. They weren't the community I was trying to reach in the first place, and it wasn't from where I was writing, and it isn't to where I'm writing, so it wasn't really a big deal in that sense. But it is a curiosity. It's a kind of noticing of just the way in which people make assumptions, because I don't tend to be that directly engaged in that particular marketplace myself. So there's just some triviality to how all of that has ended up becoming associated. But there it is.
Yeah. Forrest, I just want to honor you for elevating consciousness and for helping us discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. And, that's the tagline of my show, but I really feel like you embody those words. And, I'm just grateful that, you make yourself so accessible and that you give your time. And, you were saying how you're not just an armchair philosopher, that you actually work with your hands. And want to apologize. I think my son just came, so there may be a little crying and noise, but there is this sense that of embodiment that I feel with you that you don't necessarily feel with a lot of philosophers. And so I just appreciate that, and I appreciate this conversation, and just want to thank you for coming on the show and lending some of your wisdom for us.
Excellent. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Forrest. Appreciate you.